The night before history changed, there was no sign that the small town of Clermont would be remembered for nearly 1,000 years. The air was cold enough to leave a pale mist above the fields. Travelers arrived on muddy roads with tired horses, worn boots, and stories gathered from every corner of Europe. Bishops in heavy robes spoke quietly beneath church walls. Noblemen measured one another with careful eyes. Farmers, merchants, and wandering pilgrims pressed together, hoping to hear words that would soon travel farther than anyone present could imagine. No armies had begun to march. No castles had fallen. No great battles had yet been fought. And yet, in that gathering, a single speech would awaken dreams, fears, ambitions, and promises powerful enough to send tens of thousands of people across mountains, rivers, deserts, and unfamiliar kingdoms toward a land many of them had never seen. The First Crusade is often remembered as a story of knights and battles. But beneath the shining armor and famous victories lay something far more human. It was a story of faith and uncertainty, hope and hunger, courage and misunderstanding. It was a journey that changed not only the Holy Land but also the people who believed they were answering a sacred calling. Welcome back. If you enjoy these slow journeys through the forgotten paths of history, consider supporting the channel with a quiet like and a subscription. And if you feel like sharing, leave a comment telling us where in the world you are listening tonight. There is something comforting about imagining people in different countries, under different night skies, settling into the same story. Now, allow the day to drift away. Let your breathing become a little slower. Let the room grow quieter around you. Tonight, we travel back more than 9 centuries, to an age of castles, monasteries, crowded marketplaces, distant pilgrimages, and kingdoms that believed heaven itself could shape the course of history. To understand why thousands willingly left everything behind, we must first understand the world they lived in. Europe in the late 11th century was a continent still finding its balance after centuries of change. The mighty Roman Empire of the ancient world had disappeared long ago, leaving behind fragments of roads, crumbling cities, forgotten forts, and memories of imperial order. In its place stood dozens of kingdoms, duchies, counties, and lordships. Some rulers controlled vast territories. Others possessed only a handful of villages surrounded by forests and fields. Power shifted constantly through marriage, inheritance, and war. Most people never traveled very far from the place where they were born. A farmer might spend an entire lifetime within sight of the same church tower. Seasons governed life more than politics. Spring brought planting. Summer demanded endless labor beneath the sun. Autumn meant gathering crops before winter arrived. During the cold months, families crowded around smoky hearths while stories passed from one generation to another. Life was difficult. Harvests could fail without warning. Disease often arrived without explanation. Medical knowledge remained limited. A simple infection could become deadly. Childbirth carried enormous risks. Even wealthy nobles understood that life was uncertain. Faith offered stability where certainty could not. The church stood at the center of medieval society. Church bells marked the hours of the day. Priests blessed newborn children, celebrated marriages, comforted the dying, and buried the dead. Monasteries preserved books copied patiently by hand, protecting ancient knowledge through centuries that were anything but peaceful. Religion was not simply something people practiced. It shaped how they understood the universe. Heaven and hell were not distant ideas but living realities. Miracles seemed possible. Saints were believed to watch over communities. Pilgrimages promised spiritual renewal. Every hardship carried religious meaning. This worldview helps explain something that can appear difficult for modern audiences to understand. When medieval people heard that holy places were threatened or that fellow Christians in distant lands needed help, many believed they were hearing more than political news. They believed they were hearing a call from God. But Europe was only one part of a much larger world. Far to the southeast stood one of history's greatest cities. Constantinople. Its enormous walls stretched across the landscape like mountains built by human hands. Golden domes reflected sunlight across the Bosporus. Ships crowded its harbors carrying silk from Asia, spices from distant markets, precious metals, glassware, wine, and grain. Visitors often struggled to describe its beauty. Compared with many European towns, Constantinople seemed almost unimaginably wealthy. Wide streets bustled with merchants speaking Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Latin, and countless other languages. Elegant churches stood beside busy markets. Imperial officials managed an empire that still considered itself the true continuation of ancient Rome. This was the Byzantine Empire. Although the Western Roman Empire had fallen centuries earlier, the Eastern Empire endured. Its emperors ruled from Constantinople with ceremonies filled with dazzling displays of imperial authority. Court life combined politics, diplomacy, religion, and careful symbolism. Yet beneath this magnificent appearance, serious problems were beginning to grow. The empire faced enemies along nearly every frontier. In the Balkans, new powers emerged. Across the Mediterranean, rival states competed for influence. Most importantly, from the east came a rising force that few Europeans yet fully understood. The Seljuk Turks. Originally migrating from Central Asia, the Seljuks had embraced Islam and built an expanding empire with astonishing speed. Skilled horsemen and capable military leaders, they transformed the political landscape of the Middle East. Their victories reshaped borders that had remained relatively stable for generations. One battle in particular echoed through history. In 1071, near the town of Manzikert, Byzantine Emperor Romanos IV confronted the Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan. The battle ended in disaster for Byzantium. The emperor himself was captured. The defeat opened much of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to Turkish settlement and control. This mattered enormously. Anatolia had long served as the empire's heartland. Its fertile fields produced grain. Its towns supplied soldiers. Its roads connected Constantinople with eastern provinces. Losing these lands weakened the empire in ways that could not easily be repaired. At first, the consequences unfolded slowly. Villages changed hands. Frontiers shifted. Merchants adjusted their routes. Families fled uncertain regions. But beneath these scattered events, something much larger had begun to move. The Byzantine Empire was no longer as secure as it had once seemed. Several years later, a new emperor came to the throne. Alexios I Komnenos. History has a habit of reducing rulers to simple titles, but Alexios was a far more complicated figure. He inherited an empire under immense pressure. The treasury struggled. Enemies surrounded him. Political rivals watched for weakness. Every decision carried enormous risks. Alexios proved intelligent, determined, and remarkably adaptable. He strengthened defenses. He reorganized finances. He rebuilt parts of the army. Yet he also understood something uncomfortable. The empire could not recover alone. That realization led him toward Western Europe. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles farther south lay Jerusalem. Few cities on earth have carried such deep spiritual meaning for so many people. For Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, Jerusalem held sacred memories reaching back centuries. Stone walls enclosed narrow streets where merchants sold food, cloth, pottery, oil, and spices. Pilgrims arrived exhausted after journeys lasting months. Some came praying for forgiveness. Others sought healing. Many simply wished to stand where they believed prophets had walked. The city had changed rulers many times. Empires rose. Empires fell. Life continued. Muslim governments had generally allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the holy places, although conditions varied depending upon politics and local rulers. Reality proved more complicated than many later legends suggested. Stories traveling across medieval Europe often grew larger with every retelling. A difficult journey became an impossible one. A local conflict became universal persecution. Rumors mixed with genuine hardship until few listeners could separate one from the other. That mattered. Because people often act not only on facts but on what they believe to be true. As reports spread westward, concern deepened. Pilgrims described dangerous roads. Merchants repeated alarming stories heard in distant markets. Church leaders worried about fellow Christians living under increasing pressure in parts of the East. Some reports were accurate. Others were exaggerated. Still others remain impossible for historians to verify today. But together they created a powerful emotional picture. Across Europe, many people came to believe that the Holy Land needed protection. At the same time, another important struggle shaped Western Christianity. For generations, popes and kings had argued over authority. Who possessed greater power? Could emperors appoint bishops? Should the church stand above earthly rulers? These debates reached into every kingdom. Pope Urban II inherited not only spiritual responsibilities but also political challenges. He hoped to strengthen the authority of the papacy. He also recognized an opportunity that reached far beyond church politics. If Western knights, who so often fought one another, could instead unite behind a common religious purpose, perhaps violence within Europe might decrease while strengthening Christianity abroad. It was an ambitious vision. Whether it could actually succeed remained uncertain. Still, the idea continued to grow. Then came the message from Emperor Alexios. He requested military assistance against the advancing Seljuk Turks. His appeal was practical. He wanted trained soldiers, experienced knights, professional military support. He almost certainly did not imagine the extraordinary response his request would eventually inspire. The decision seemed modest at first. Send help to an ally. Defend Christian lands. Assist the Byzantine Empire. But history rarely unfolds according to original plans. When Pope Urban II gathered church leaders and nobles at Clermont in November of 1095, the moment carried possibilities that almost no one fully understood. The crowd waited. Some stood in open fields because buildings could not contain everyone who wished to listen. Cold air drifted across the assembly. Faces turned toward the Pope. Then Urban began to speak. His exact words have not survived. Different chroniclers recorded different versions years later. Historians continue debating what he truly said. Yet the central message appears remarkably consistent. He spoke of suffering Christians in the East. He described Jerusalem and the holy places. He urged Western Christians to stop fighting among themselves and instead undertake a sacred expedition unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. Those who joined, he promised, would receive spiritual rewards through the remission of sins, provided they undertook the journey with sincere devotion. The response stunned even those who had organized the gathering. Voices rose across the crowd. Some witnesses later claimed that people cried out together, "God wills it." Whether every detail happened exactly that way remains uncertain. But there is little doubt that extraordinary emotion swept through the assembly. Men began sewing cloth crosses onto their clothing. Nobles pledged support. Priests preached the message across towns and villages. Word spread with astonishing speed through a continent where news usually traveled only as fast as a horse could ride. Something immense had begun. Not everyone understood where the road would lead. Not everyone joined for the same reason. Some sought spiritual forgiveness. Others hoped for honor. Some dreamed of adventure. Others simply followed neighbors, relatives, or local lords. For many ordinary people, the Holy Land existed only in prayers, sermons, and sacred stories. Now, for the first time, it seemed possible to walk the very roads where they believed Christ had lived. It was an idea both beautiful and dangerous. And before the great armies of princes even set foot on the long road to Jerusalem, another movement unexpected, chaotic, and far less prepared would surge eastward ahead of them, changing the course of the crusade before it had truly begun. That, however, is where the story becomes even more remarkable. For a brief moment, it seemed as though all of Europe had begun to move. The roads that had once carried merchants, monks, and wandering pilgrims now filled with an extraordinary mixture of people. Knights polished helmets that reflected the pale morning sun. Blacksmiths worked late into the night repairing swords, horseshoes, and armor. Priests blessed travelers before village churches while anxious families stood nearby, uncertain whether they would ever see their loved ones again. The excitement spread faster than careful planning. That would become one of the defining features of the First Crusade. Pope Urban II had intended that the expedition should begin many months later, giving rulers enough time to gather supplies, organize armies, and prepare for a journey of nearly 3,000 kilometers. Such an undertaking demanded remarkable discipline. Food had to be collected. Horses needed fodder. Weapons required maintenance. Agreements with rulers along the route had to be negotiated. But not everyone was willing to wait. Across France, the German lands, northern Italy, and beyond, ordinary people heard the Pope's message in ways that went far beyond its original intention. Traveling preachers carried the story from village to village, often adding details of their own. Every retelling grew more emotional. Every sermon painted the Holy Land in brighter colors. For many listeners, Jerusalem no longer seemed like a distant city beyond deserts and mountains. It became a dream. And dreams have a remarkable power over people living difficult lives. Many peasants had spent years working land they did not own. Heavy taxes weighed upon poor harvests. Famine had visited some regions only a few years earlier. Violence between rival nobles could destroy villages with little warning. Disease remained a constant companion. When they heard that God was calling them to a sacred journey, some believed this was not simply an opportunity. It was an answer. One of the most remarkable figures to emerge during this time was not a king or a famous knight. He was a wandering preacher known as Peter the Hermit. History remembers him as a small man with a long beard, simple clothing, and an intense, almost magnetic presence. Later chroniclers described him riding a humble donkey from town to town, speaking with such conviction that crowds gathered wherever he appeared. Whether every legendary detail is true remains uncertain. Medieval writers often transformed real people into larger-than-life figures. But there is little doubt that Peter possessed extraordinary charisma. He spoke directly to ordinary people rather than powerful nobles. He described Jerusalem with deep emotion. He urged Christians to begin the journey immediately. His words inspired thousands. Farmers abandoned their fields. Craftsmen closed their workshops. Women packed what little food they could carry. Children followed their parents into an adventure that few truly understood. This movement would later become known as the People's Crusade. It was unlike the armies that would eventually follow. There was very little military organization. Many travelers owned no weapons beyond hunting knives, farm tools, or wooden clubs. Some had never traveled farther than the nearest market town. Few understood the geography ahead. Maps were rare. Many people simply followed the crowd. For a while, hope seemed stronger than practical reality. The roads became rivers of humanity. Colorful banners fluttered in the wind. Church hymns echoed through valleys. Wagons creaked beneath blankets, cooking pots, and family possessions. Some travelers believed they would reach Jerusalem within weeks. In truth, they faced a journey that would take many months. And the greatest hardships had not yet begun. As these vast crowds crossed Europe, they encountered the first challenge of every great expedition. Food. An army does not eat ideas. Neither does a pilgrimage of tens of thousands. Each day required enormous quantities of bread, grain, meat, water, and fodder for animals. Small villages simply could not support such numbers. At first, local communities welcomed the travelers. Priests offered blessings. Monasteries shared what food they could spare. Some nobles donated supplies. But generosity has limits. Soon shortages appeared. Prices rose. Arguments broke out. Some desperate travelers stole livestock or grain. Others begged. Tensions slowly increased between the crusading crowds and the people whose lands they crossed. Not everyone marching east behaved honorably. This is one of the more uncomfortable parts of the story. The First Crusade is often remembered through images of noble knights riding toward Jerusalem. Reality was far more complicated. Within the People's Crusade were individuals driven by sincere faith. There were also opportunists, criminals, and reckless adventurers. Large crowds are rarely made of one kind of person. As discipline weakened, violence began to appear. In several regions, terrible attacks were carried out against Jewish communities. These attacks were not ordered by Pope Urban II. In fact, many bishops and local rulers attempted to stop them. Some courageously sheltered Jewish families inside castles, churches, or fortified towns. Others lacked the power to prevent the violence. The suffering was immense. Entire communities that had lived peacefully for generations suddenly faced fear, robbery, and death. These events remain among the darkest chapters connected to the beginning of the Crusades. They remind us that movements driven by powerful beliefs can sometimes escape the control of those who first inspired them. And history rarely follows the intentions of its founders. Meanwhile, Peter the Hermit continued leading thousands toward the east. The landscape slowly changed. The forests of Western Europe gave way to broad plains. Wide rivers cut across the countryside. Old Roman roads, though damaged by centuries of weather, still guided travelers toward lands that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Languages changed. Coins changed. Customs changed. Even the architecture looked different. Many crusaders had never imagined cities larger than those in their own kingdoms. Then, at last, they approached Constantinople. Nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. The city's mighty walls rose from the earth like cliffs of carefully shaped stone. Massive towers stood at regular intervals, guarding gates through which merchants from 3 continents entered every day. Beyond the walls shimmered churches crowned with golden domes. The great harbor overflowed with ships carrying goods from Egypt, Italy, the Black Sea, and lands even farther away. To many Western Europeans, Constantinople seemed almost unreal. Some believed it must surely be the richest city on earth. Markets overflowed with silk, perfumes, spices, precious glass, ivory carvings, and books copied in beautiful handwriting. Water flowed through sophisticated aqueducts. Public buildings displayed mosaics that glittered beneath sunlight. Compared with many Western towns, the Byzantine capital represented a level of wealth and organization that astonished its visitors. Yet admiration was mixed with suspicion. The Byzantines and Western Europeans both considered themselves Christian. But centuries of cultural differences had created deep misunderstandings. The Byzantines spoke mostly Greek. The Crusaders spoke Latin, French, German, Italian, and many regional languages. Religious traditions differed. Political expectations differed. Even table manners and clothing reflected separate worlds. Emperor Alexios I welcomed the arrival of Western assistance. But what stood before him was not the disciplined army he had requested. Instead, he found enormous crowds of poorly organized pilgrims whose enthusiasm greatly exceeded their preparation. The emperor quickly realized the danger. If these restless groups remained outside Constantinople for too long, they might exhaust local supplies or provoke unrest. Alexios therefore acted with characteristic practicality. He arranged for many of them to cross the Bosporus into Asia Minor as quickly as possible. From his perspective, this solved several problems at once. The pilgrims would move toward lands occupied by the Seljuk Turks. Constantinople would remain secure. And perhaps the Crusaders might even recover some Byzantine territory. It was a reasonable decision. But it carried enormous risks. Most members of the People's Crusade had little military experience. Many ignored advice from Byzantine officers who understood the region far better than they did. Patience proved difficult. The Holy Land still lay far away. Yet some Crusaders believed victory would come easily because God favored their cause. Faith gave them courage. Overconfidence sometimes replaced caution. The Seljuk Turks watched these developments carefully. Unlike the Crusaders, they understood the landscape intimately. They knew the roads, the water sources, the hills, and the forests. They possessed experienced cavalry skilled in mobility, discipline, and surprise attacks. For a short time, the People's Crusade established camps in Anatolia. Some groups raided nearby settlements. Others argued among themselves. Leadership became increasingly divided. Food again grew scarce. Morale began to weaken. Still, many believed success remained close. Then came the mistake. Rumors spread through the camps that nearby Turkish towns contained enormous wealth waiting to be captured. Some leaders urged caution. Others insisted that immediate action would bring easy victory. History has a habit of rewarding patience more often than confidence. Unfortunately, patience lost. Near the fortress of Civitate in October 1096, thousands of Crusaders advanced without proper scouting or coordinated planning. The Seljuk commander Kilij Arslan had been observing their movements. He recognized their weaknesses. Rather than attacking blindly, he chose his moment carefully. When the Crusaders entered difficult terrain, the Turkish forces struck with speed. Mounted archers appeared almost without warning. Arrows darkened the sky. Panic spread rapidly through the Crusader ranks. Without disciplined formations or experienced commanders able to restore order, confusion turned into catastrophe. Groups became separated. Retreating pilgrims collided with those still advancing. Many fled toward the forests. Others attempted to return to their camp. Few escaped. The defeat at Civitate effectively destroyed the People's Crusade. Thousands perished. Many others were captured. A handful managed to return to Constantinople carrying stories of disaster. Peter the Hermit himself survived, having been in Constantinople seeking additional supplies when the battle occurred. He returned to discover that much of the movement he had inspired had vanished. The dream that had begun with songs, prayers, and overwhelming hope had ended in tragedy. Yet the First Crusade itself had not failed. In many ways, it had not truly begun. Far behind the scattered pilgrims, the real armies of Europe were still preparing. These were not wandering crowds but carefully organized forces led by some of the most powerful nobles of their age. They marched under different banners. They often distrusted one another. Some had old rivalries stretching back years. None accepted a single commander. And yet each believed that reaching Jerusalem would transform both history and their own souls. Among them were men whose names would become legendary: Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Tancred, Robert of Normandy, and several others. Each carried different ambitions. Each viewed the crusade through a different lens. Some sought spiritual redemption. Some hoped to win honor. Some dreamed of glory that would outlive them. Others quietly wondered whether new lands and opportunities might await in the east. As the seasons slowly turned and winter gave way to another spring, these great armies began moving toward Constantinople from every direction. The roads once again filled with marching men, armored horses, wagons loaded with provisions, priests carrying crosses, blacksmiths, cooks, servants, engineers, and countless ordinary followers. Europe had answered the call. But as these armies approached the Byzantine Empire, another question quietly emerged. Would these proud leaders be able to cooperate long enough to survive the journey? Or would the divisions they carried from home prove more dangerous than any enemy waiting beyond the horizon? That answer would shape not only the fate of Jerusalem, but the future relationship between East and West for centuries to come. When the first of the great princely armies finally appeared outside the walls of Constantinople, Emperor Alexios, I felt both relief and concern. Relief, because these were the experienced warriors he had hoped for when he sent his appeal to the West. Concern, because each army was led by a powerful noble accustomed to giving orders rather than receiving them. There was no single commander of the First Crusade. Instead, there were several ambitious leaders, each surrounded by loyal knights, trusted advisors, family members, priests, and soldiers who believed their own lord deserved the greatest honor. It was a partnership built on necessity rather than friendship. That mattered. Because before they could face the Seljuk Turks, they would first have to learn how to work together. The first to arrive included Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the King of France. Soon afterward came Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, followed by his brother Baldwin. Then Raymond IV of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most respected nobles in Europe, entered Byzantine lands with a large and well-equipped force. Not long after them came perhaps the most fascinating figure of all. Bohemond of Taranto. History has a habit of flattening people into heroes or villains. Bohemond was neither. He was tall, confident, intelligent, and deeply ambitious. Years earlier, he had fought against the Byzantine Empire alongside his father during wars in southern Italy. Now he arrived at Constantinople claiming to be its ally. Alexios could hardly ignore the irony. He welcomed Bohemond politely, but trust did not come easily. The emperor had spent years surviving political intrigue. He knew that smiles in royal courts often concealed dangerous intentions. The Crusader leaders were invited into the magnificent imperial palace. Many had never witnessed such splendor. Walls shimmered with golden mosaics. Silk curtains hung from polished marble columns. Candles reflected from jeweled icons that seemed almost to glow in the quiet halls. Officials dressed in brilliantly colored robes moved with careful ceremony through long corridors where every gesture carried meaning. The Byzantine court believed that power should not only exist. It should be seen. Some Western nobles admired what they found. Others quietly viewed such luxury with suspicion. To them, the Byzantine world seemed elegant but complicated. The emperor, meanwhile, viewed his guests with equal caution. These men had crossed half of Europe with thousands of armed followers. If relations broke down, Constantinople itself might be threatened. Alexios therefore insisted upon one important condition. Any former Byzantine territory recovered during the campaign should be returned to the empire. To secure this promise, he asked each Crusader leader to swear an oath of loyalty. Some accepted without much argument. Others hesitated. Raymond of Toulouse resisted the wording, unwilling to become what appeared to be the emperor's vassal. Long discussions followed. Compromises were carefully arranged. Eventually, most leaders agreed in one form or another. Whether they intended to honor those promises later remained another question entirely. The agreements brought temporary peace. But beneath the formal ceremonies, uncertainty lingered like a shadow. Neither side fully trusted the other. The Crusaders believed the Byzantines might abandon them if circumstances became difficult. The Byzantines feared that successful Western armies might decide to keep conquered lands for themselves. Both concerns would prove justified before the crusade was over. Still, there was little choice except to continue. Spring arrived. Ships ferried thousands of Crusaders across the narrow waters of the Bosporus. For many, it was the first time they had ever set foot in Asia. The landscape looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains. Ancient Roman roads crossed fertile valleys. Small villages dotted the countryside. Yet every mile carried them farther from the world they had always known. The first major objective lay ahead. The city of Nicaea. Today it is called Iznik, but in 1097 it was one of the most important cities under Seljuk control. Strong stone walls surrounded the city. Towers overlooked the countryside. A beautiful lake protected one side, making attack especially difficult. Its ruler believed the city could withstand almost any siege. At first, that confidence seemed reasonable. The Crusader armies surrounded Nicaea from the landward side. Siege camps quickly appeared. Rows of tents stretched across the fields. Blacksmiths repaired damaged armor. Carpenters built siege equipment from nearby timber. Priests celebrated Mass beneath simple canvas shelters. Messengers rode constantly between commanders discussing plans, supplies, and defenses. Life during a medieval siege followed its own slow rhythm. Days often passed without dramatic fighting. Soldiers repaired walls damaged the previous day. Archers exchanged arrows across open ground. Engineers measured distances with remarkable patience. Meanwhile, ordinary camp followers cooked meals, tended horses, mended clothing, and cared for the wounded. For many people, waiting became harder than battle. Food remained a constant concern. Thousands of mouths needed feeding every day. Water had to be found. Animals required grazing land. Disease threatened crowded camps where sanitation was difficult. A successful siege demanded endurance as much as courage. Inside Nicaea, conditions slowly became more difficult. Supplies diminished. Families wondered how long the walls could protect them. Children listened to unfamiliar sounds outside the city gates, the pounding of hammers, the shouting of soldiers, the creaking of siege machines slowly moving into position. The defenders remained determined. But beyond the walls, another danger was approaching. Kilij Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan who had crushed the People's Crusade only months earlier, hurried westward after realizing that these new arrivals were very different. He had underestimated them at first. He believed this latest force would be another disorganized crowd of pilgrims. Instead, he discovered experienced knights supported by thousands of disciplined infantry. The mistake was costly. When Kilij Arslan attacked the Crusader camp, he encountered fierce resistance. The battle lasted for hours beneath the warm Anatolian sun. Heavy cavalry charged where opportunities appeared. Archers searched for gaps in enemy formations. Dust filled the air until visibility became difficult. Neither side found an easy victory. Eventually, the Seljuk forces withdrew. For the defenders inside Nicaea, hope faded. The relieving army had failed. Yet the city did not fall by force alone. Emperor Alexios had quietly arranged negotiations with those inside the walls. Using ships transported across land to the lake, Byzantine forces established contact beyond the Crusaders' view. Secret discussions followed. The defenders agreed to surrender, not to the Crusaders, but to the Byzantine Emperor. One morning, the Crusaders awoke expecting to prepare a final assault. Instead, they saw Byzantine banners flying above the city. The gates had opened peacefully during the night. Nicaea belonged once again to the empire. The Crusaders had helped win the siege. But they were denied the opportunity to storm the city and claim the wealth that traditionally followed a successful capture. Many felt deeply disappointed. Some felt betrayed. Bohemond was furious. Other leaders questioned whether Alexios had acted honestly. From the emperor's perspective, however, his decision made perfect sense. Nicaea had always been Byzantine territory. Why allow unnecessary destruction if peaceful surrender could restore the city intact? Both sides believed they had acted reasonably. Both sides also left the experience with less trust than before. And this was only the beginning. Beyond Nicaea stretched hundreds of kilometers of difficult country. The real journey had scarcely begun. The Crusader army divided into separate columns to make travel easier. Moving tens of thousands of people along narrow medieval roads demanded careful organization. Large groups consumed local supplies too quickly. Separate routes reduced pressure on villages while allowing the armies to reunite when necessary. At first, the march seemed peaceful. Fields waved gently beneath the summer wind. Wildflowers covered the hillsides. Ancient milestones still marked stretches of Roman road. Occasionally the Crusaders passed abandoned villages where broken walls hinted at older conflicts. Then came another test. Near Dorylaeum, one column led largely by Bohemond advanced ahead of the others. The morning began quietly. Campfires still smoked as soldiers prepared breakfast. Some knights cared for horses. Others repaired equipment damaged during previous marches. Without warning, Turkish horse archers appeared across the surrounding hills. Their attack was swift and carefully planned. Arrows rained into the Crusader camp before defensive formations could fully develop. The Seljuk cavalry refused close combat. Instead, they rode quickly around the camp, firing arrows with remarkable accuracy before disappearing beyond reach. Again and again they returned. Bohemond recognized the danger immediately. He ordered his men to hold their ground. Charging recklessly after mounted archers would only scatter his forces. So the Crusaders formed defensive positions. Knights dismounted. Infantry raised shields. Women, children, servants, and pack animals gathered toward the center of the camp while soldiers created a protective ring around them. Hour after hour, the attacks continued. The summer heat grew oppressive. Horses became exhausted. Water supplies diminished. Some believed defeat was inevitable. Yet Bohemond refused to abandon the position. Messengers raced desperately toward the Second Crusader column, urging immediate assistance. Time became the most valuable resource on the battlefield. Every minute mattered. At last, banners appeared on the horizon. Godfrey of Bouillon arrived first. Soon afterward came Raymond of Toulouse and additional forces. Fresh troops entered the battle from different directions. The balance shifted. For the first time that day, the Seljuk horsemen faced the possibility of becoming trapped. Kilij Arslan recognized the changing situation. His army had fought skillfully. But remaining too long risked disaster. The Turkish forces gradually withdrew, disappearing across the plains with the same speed that had made them so dangerous. The Crusaders had survived. The victory at Dorylaeum was important for reasons beyond the battlefield itself. It taught the Western armies a difficult lesson. Their familiar methods of warfare would not always succeed in Anatolia. European knights preferred decisive clashes. The Seljuks preferred movement, distance, patience, and constant harassment. Future success would require adaptation. It also strengthened confidence among the Crusader leaders. They had endured one of the most dangerous moments of the expedition. They had not broken. But triumph carried its own price. The road ahead crossed the dry interior of Anatolia during the hottest weeks of summer. Water became scarce. Grass disappeared. The earth cracked beneath relentless sunlight. Heavy armor that protected soldiers in battle became exhausting under the blazing sky. Many horses collapsed from thirst. Some never rose again. And as the Crusaders pressed deeper into Asia Minor, they discovered that the greatest enemy was no longer an army waiting beyond the next hill. It was the land itself. The victory at Dorylaeum had given the Crusaders something they desperately needed. Confidence. For days after the battle, conversations around evening campfires carried a quieter sense of hope. Men who had expected to die now spoke of Jerusalem with renewed determination. Priests reminded exhausted soldiers that every difficult step brought them closer to the city they believed God had called them to reach. But confidence could not fill an empty water skin. Nor could it feed a hungry horse. The armies now entered the vast interior of Anatolia, where the landscape itself became their greatest opponent. The green valleys of Western Asia Minor slowly disappeared behind them. In their place stretched wide plains baked beneath an unforgiving summer sun. The wind carried dust instead of cool river air. Trees became increasingly rare, and streams that appeared on old maps often proved to be little more than dry channels carved into the earth. The Crusaders had expected battles. Few had expected silence. Hour after hour, they marched beneath enormous skies where little moved except the columns of men and animals stretching across the horizon. Armor grew painfully hot beneath the midday sun. Iron helmets trapped heat until some soldiers removed them despite the danger. Leather boots wore thin against rough stone roads that had not been properly maintained for generations. Every day began before sunrise. The camp slowly awakened as cooks stirred small fires into life. Horses were watered whenever possible. Blacksmiths inspected damaged equipment. Priests gathered groups for morning prayers while scouts rode ahead searching for the safest routes. Then the march would begin again. The rhythm rarely changed. Walk. Rest. Search for water. Walk again. For ordinary soldiers, the crusade became less a series of glorious battles than an endless struggle against exhaustion. Many had left Europe believing that victory depended upon courage alone. Now they learned that survival often depended upon patience. One careless decision could cost an entire company its water supply. One missed spring might leave hundreds dangerously dehydrated. And beneath all of this, another problem slowly emerged. The Seljuk Turks had no intention of fighting every battle directly. Instead, they watched. Small groups of mounted scouts shadowed the Crusader columns from a distance. They rarely attacked large formations. Instead, they searched for opportunities. A supply wagon separated from the main army. A small group of foragers collecting food. A messenger traveling alone. These became easier targets. The strategy was remarkably effective. Every lost horse weakened the army's mobility. Every missing wagon reduced food supplies. Every successful ambush increased anxiety among the marching columns. The Crusaders soon realized they were being observed almost constantly. Even when no enemy appeared, someone was probably watching from distant hills. It created a strange kind of tension. Not loud. Not immediate. But always present. The danger was not where most people expected it to be. Sometimes days passed without a single battle. Then suddenly arrows would emerge from the horizon before disappearing just as quickly. The uncertainty became exhausting. To understand why this campaign remained possible at all, we have to leave the battlefield for a moment and look at something less dramatic but equally important. Logistics. History often remembers great commanders and famous victories. Far less attention is given to the people who baked bread, repaired wagons, cared for wounded animals, or searched unfamiliar villages for grain. Yet armies cannot survive without them. Every evening the camps became temporary cities. Thousands of tents appeared across the landscape. Cooking fires filled the air with the smell of smoke and boiling stew. Armor was cleaned of dust. Broken spear shafts were replaced. Letters were written whenever messengers could be found. Some soldiers laughed together around the fires, grateful simply to have survived another day. Others sat quietly, staring into the flames while thinking of families far away. Many had never been absent from home for so long. Some wondered whether their children still remembered their faces. Others quietly questioned whether they would ever return. History has a habit of remembering rulers. But the crusade belonged just as much to these ordinary people. The anonymous foot soldier carrying a heavy shield. The young stable boy caring for exhausted horses. The cook dividing limited food among hungry companions. The priest comforting a dying stranger whose name would never appear in any chronicle. Their stories rarely survive. Yet without them, the expedition could never have continued. Eventually the Crusaders reached territory that had suffered greatly from years of warfare. Entire villages stood abandoned. Collapsed roofs lay scattered among overgrown fields. Empty churches echoed with silence. Fruit trees still grew beside homes whose owners had disappeared long before. Some had fled invading armies. Others had been driven away by famine. Some simply sought safer places to rebuild their lives. For the Crusaders, these deserted settlements provided temporary shelter but little food. The land itself bore the scars of conflict. Meanwhile, Emperor Alexios remained far behind. At first, Byzantine guides and soldiers had accompanied portions of the expedition, helping recover former imperial territory. But as the Crusaders pushed deeper into regions no longer firmly controlled by Constantinople, Byzantine influence gradually faded. This would have lasting consequences. Many Western leaders began feeling increasingly isolated. If difficulties arose now, they could expect little assistance from the empire. Some quietly blamed Alexios for not advancing farther. The emperor, meanwhile, believed he had already fulfilled his obligations. Both sides viewed events through different experiences. Neither fully understood the other's position. These misunderstandings would continue to grow. And history would remember them for centuries. As the long march continued, one of the Crusade's leaders began looking beyond the shared mission. His name was Baldwin of Boulogne, younger brother of Godfrey of Bouillon. Unlike many companions who remained focused solely upon Jerusalem, Baldwin recognized another opportunity. To the east lay the Armenian city of Edessa. Its Christian rulers faced constant pressure from neighboring powers and desperately needed strong allies. Local politics were complicated. Old rivalries divided noble families. Regional rulers balanced fragile alliances while watching larger empires struggle for influence around them. When Baldwin arrived, he was welcomed with remarkable warmth. The elderly ruler of Edessa, Thuras, lacked a natural heir and hoped that adopting the respected Western noble might strengthen his own position. For a brief time, the arrangement seemed promising. But politics in the medieval world rarely remained peaceful for long. Discontent simmered within the city. Not everyone supported Thuras. Soon unrest erupted. The exact sequence of events remains debated by historians. What seems clear is that Thuras was killed during the turmoil, and Baldwin emerged as the city's new ruler. With that, something entirely unexpected happened. The First Crusade had not yet reached Jerusalem. Yet the First Crusader state had already been created. The county of Edessa became the earliest permanent Western Christian territory established in the East. For Baldwin personally, it represented enormous success. He now possessed lands, wealth, influence, and an independent base of power. But his departure also reduced the strength of the main crusading army. Every experienced knight mattered. Every commander counted. Still, the expedition continued. Those who remained pressed steadily southward toward northern Syria. The climate slowly changed again. Dry plains gave way to fertile valleys crossed by rivers that had nourished civilizations for thousands of years. Palm trees occasionally appeared beside flowing water. Markets displayed unfamiliar fruits and spices. The languages spoken by local merchants became increasingly diverse. Greek, Arabic, Armenian, Syriac, Turkish, Persian, Latin. The medieval Near East was far more culturally varied than many Western crusaders had imagined. Different religions also lived side by side. Muslims formed the majority across much of the region. Eastern Christian communities had existed for centuries. Jewish communities contributed to trade, scholarship, and urban life. The political landscape proved just as complex. There was no single united Muslim empire waiting to oppose the Crusaders. Instead, rival dynasties competed for territory and influence. Governors sometimes distrusted neighboring rulers more than distant enemies. These divisions would play an important role in the months ahead. The Crusaders did not yet fully understand this. But they would soon benefit from it. By October of 1097, another city appeared on the horizon. Larger, richer, far stronger than any they had yet encountered. Antioch. Its walls stretched for miles across hills and valleys, protected by hundreds of towers that followed the contours of the surrounding mountains. The city had stood for more than 1,000 years. Romans had ruled here. Byzantines had ruled here. Now it belonged to the Seljuk Turks. Few places in the medieval world possessed greater strategic importance. Any army marching toward Jerusalem had to reckon with Antioch. Leaving such a powerful fortress behind would be extraordinarily dangerous. Yet capturing it would test the Crusaders as never before. Many who first saw its defenses wondered privately whether success was even possible. The walls seemed endless. The towers overlooked every approach. Behind those walls waited experienced defenders with ample supplies. Winter was also approaching. The easy marches of summer had ended. Rain clouds gathered above the mountains. Cold winds replaced the relentless heat of Anatolia. The Crusaders had reached Antioch. But they had also reached the beginning of what would become one of the longest, hardest, and most decisive sieges of the entire First Crusade. Before Jerusalem could even come into view, they would have to survive hunger, disease, betrayal, freezing nights, and one of medieval history's greatest tests of endurance. And for many of them, the greatest battle of the Crusade was about to begin, not for the holy city itself, but beneath the towering walls of Antioch.